Hello, everyone. Welcome back again to our discussion of informal fallacies. In this video, we're going to look at the fallacy known as false dilemma, and also a similar version of the false dilemma that's called the decision point fallacy. Now, notice that Vaughan labels this fallacy as false dilemma, and that's correct. But it's also sometimes described as the either or fallacy and sometimes the false dichotomy fallacy. So I mentioned that just because sometimes people will refer to it as the either or the false dichotomy. And if that's the case, then what they mean here is the false dilemma. So these names, these labels can be used interchangeably. But the basic idea is always going to be the same. That's the idea that you're only given two choices, A or B, when there might actually be some alternative choices, alternative options that exist. So when you're minimizing your choices such that you're not able to choose from the full spectrum of different options. One example might be if somebody says, well, you're either going to support Trump or you're a traitor to the country. Well, clearly that's not the case. Somebody can disagree with Trump. Somebody might think that what Trump is doing is bad for the country without being a traitor to the country, right? So there's other options. There's alternative choices that one can make. Another example that oftentimes comes up is, well, you either support a gun ban or you support mass shootings. Well, obviously, if somebody does not support a gun ban, this does not necessarily mean that they support mass shootings. They could be totally against gun violence, yet still think that we should avoid gun bans. So what's going on here is there's more nuances involved that you're not being shown, right? There's alternative options that might exist and that are not available for you here. Another similar sort of example is when somebody says, well, you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. There's no nuances involved. But you might think that's false. Maybe it depends upon the details of the case. Maybe there's other options that we should consider. Or another sort of example would be when somebody says the government is either incompetent or just plain evil. Either way, we're screwed. But that's not necessarily the truth, right? Maybe there's nuances that we should pay attention to. So, by going through these examples here, what I'm hoping to show is that it's a very powerful fallacy because it gives you a false impression. It gives you the idea that you must take a side, and it ignores potential alternative ways of thinking about things. It's sort of forcing you into a decision without allowing you the chance to be able to think through the details and perhaps see alternatives that should be explored, different perspectives that should be considered. Now, notice that it is a fallacy of unacceptable premises because the premises that you're given are, in some sense, incomplete. You're not given enough information. You're not allowed to make a fully informed choice, you might say. And notice that there is a similar version of this fallacy that's called the decision point fallacy. And this version of the fallacy occurs when somebody assumes that there must be some clear boundary point, right? When the concept itself is vague, but you think, no, there must be some point in which we can say it's either A or B. If we think about this fallacy, this version of the fallacy as it pertains to what's sometimes called the Sorites problem, where we're trying to make a clear distinction between when a person is bald or when they're not bald, or when something counts as being a heap of sand and when it counts as just being a few pebbles of sand. But maybe the concept actually is vague. Maybe there is no clear-cut boundary where we can draw a line. So what's going on with this version of the fallacy, the decision point fallacy, is it's all about falsely demanding that you must find some sharp cutoff in cases where there actually is genuine vagueness built into the case itself, or built into the concept that we're considering. These fallacies are very persuasive. They're very powerful because you get the sense or the feeling that you have no other options and that there's something very important on the line. Such that if you don't make the choice, right, if you don't choose Trump or being a traitor, let's say, well, then in some sense, you're failing. When in reality, the failure is actually failing to see alternative perspectives, failing to see the nuances that are involved in these sorts of cases.